So welcome to all of you. This is the last cafe about purely about JavaScript. There are two more planned along the same lines. One in 2 weeks about JavaScript in Switch, the classical Switch environment, and one in 4 weeks from now about JavaScript in Switch, but then the new stuff, node.js stuff. But this one is still about JavaScript itself. This is for those of you who haven't been here, this is a cafe, meaning this is a regular Zoom meeting. If you want to speak up, you can. And as long as it's relevant, you're actually encouraged to speak up if you have questions. We are going to be using Node.js. I also encourage people to follow along. So if you don't have Node.js on your system, fire up Safari, look for Node.js, download and run the installer. That should take all of 1 minute, and then you can follow along if you're a fast typer. I've been told I have to type slower, but that's really difficult. So we have a nice topic for today. I have not prepared a presentation because it's much more fun doing this in code, and I will try to get through it in an hour. The topic for today is Node.js itself. So far we've been using Node.js for demonstration purposes, if you want, and we've used some of it. We haven't used all that much of it, and I wanted to do a last session on, but what is this Node.js system and how do I work with modules, for example, which I think is the basis, the foundation of how this works and how you can get advantage from it. And then once we've done that, I wanted to show you how easy it is to use it for making command line tools, which could be kind of fun. If you need to do something in an automated environment, for example, and there is no tool that can easily do it, you could write a Node.js based tool just in JavaScript, and you could still use it on the command line quite easily. And it can interact with the command line and so on. So that is actually quite fun. And then the last thing I wanted to do, but that is going to be really challenging, is I also wanted to show how you then make a web server with this. And there I will be able to show you some principles, let's put it that way, but we're not going to make a complex project that would go way too far. So let's get started. You will see me look at the side once in a while. That is because I have a bunch of preparation here. I actually have more preparation on the other side, so it's this is a bit of a challenging session. But we'll get through it, hopefully in an hour. So what are we talking about? We're talking about Node.js, so let's set ourselves up so we can do something. And I'm going to do the same thing as I did last week. It wasn't last week, it was last session, actually. So we need a folder for this. Again, I have a main folder where I have all the sessions that we've done. So this will be session number 9. In Visual Studio Code, let's make a new folder, and then we're going to call this session 9. And we're going to do the same thing we always do. We're going to convert it to a Node.js project. And now we just have a folder, but I'm going to open a terminal in it. And in that terminal, we can now do stuff. I have a little bit more or a little bit less space to play in because I managed to figure out how to change the resolution of my screen, so it's a little bit smaller, which probably means that you can see it better, but I have a little bit less space to play with here, but we'll get that done. So how do we make a Node.js project? Well, what we've done in the past is we've done npm init. And I have to be in the folder where I want that, well, the folder I want to convert. So I am in this session 9 folder, and then I want to convert it to a Node.js project, and I can do that with npm init. Now, the last sessions, I've always said, yeah, you run this and then you get some questions and you say yes, 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 yes. And then, okay, we can actually shortcut that by using -y. I also learned stuff. So this I learned last week preparing this. So if I run that, I don't have to answer any questions because NPM assumes that I'm going to answer yes on all of the questions much faster. So what did it do? Well, it added a package.json in this session 9 folder. And we have here all the stuff that we otherwise have. Like I said, it just answered yes on everything. We're going to do one more thing and save dev. I'm going to install David. I'm going to install nodemon, which we normally use as well. And if you remember the command for that, npm install is what we want to do. Nodemon is the plugin we want to install. And if you want to play it completely correct, then you use save dev, and save dev tells Node.js that this is a development tool. So you'll see that it dependency is the word I was looking for. Thank you, Node.js. So it puts it under the development dependencies, and that is not important in what we're doing here, but it's a good practice to learn because it is important, or it becomes important if you afterwards would start to deploy things to a production server, for example. You don't want to necessarily install the development dependencies on a production server. Yeah. So we installed nodemon. Now our init command assumed that we were going to use index.js. So now I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go to the session 9 folder and create a file. And I will call the file index.js. And in index.js, we'll just see whether we've done the right thing. So I'm going to do a console command. And if we save this, we should be set. So all I need to do now is I need to start this thing. And that I am going to do by, we're not set, I forgot that. So we're going to make us a dev command, and the dev command will use nodemon, and then it will run index.js. Yes, remember that under scripts in this package.json, you can have as many scripts as you want. They have a name, and then you can use npm in the terminal to execute that particular script. So if you wanted to set up dev 1 to 5 with different environments or different things, then you could easily do that. So let's save this. And down here, we can say npm run. Run tells Node or npm to look for the scripts that you have, and then I have to specify the name of the script. So npm run dev will run my index.js file. It uses nodemon, so every time I modify what I have here and I save it, it will run it again. And that was the whole intention of what we were doing here. That sets things up for us. And I'm going to delete one of the penguins here. So that was the purpose of what we were doing so far. We prepared our Node.js folder, and we have something to play with. So like I said, what I wanted to show is what the strength of Node.js is. And to me, the real strength is with all of these modules that you can use. And in order to show what that means, I'm going to go through progressively more difficult things. Well, difficult. It's not rocket science. And the first thing is that we're going to use a module that is already in Node.js. We've done that to some extent last time as well. Then we've used the FS or file system module. I'm going to use a slightly different one now, and I'm going to say that I want to use the path module. And as you may remember from last session, you can import a module by using the require keyword. And require tells node.js that it should look for a module, and then you have to give it the name of the module, and it already suggests it to me as well. So we are interested in path, and then I can save that and nothing more happens, but now I could use this path module, and we are going to. So let's give ourselves a file name, and we'll call that, we'll make a JSON file. This is just the name of the file. We don't need the file itself. And the way I can use this path module is by doing something like, what's the extension of this file? Well, it is path extension name. Again, Visual Studio Code knows what we're using. So it shows me that there is indeed a function like that. And then it will also tell me that it requires a string. And so we're going to pass the name of the file, and then we could show that on the console. So what have we done? We defined a variable called file name, and that has some content, and there could be a path in here as well before the file name. And then we used this path module that we imported and that we had the require statement for, and we used one of the functions that is available for that module. And this is all there is to it, to using a module, at least if that module is part of Node.js. Why don't we have to install this module? Because it is already part of Node.js. We haven't installed anything other than NodeMon, but if you would look in this Node modules folder, there would be a long list of modules in there already, all the things that are installed when you convert this into a Node.js project. So this just allows us to use a built-in module. We want to take it one step further, and in order to do that, I'm going to add some code here, and I'm going to do something that is relatively simple. I'm going to say if my file extension, so I'll just copy that, if that is equal to JSON, then we have a JSON file, and we're going to consider that this is a problem. So console info, this is I'll call it an error message. Error, this is a JSON file. What is this going to do? Well, it's simply going to write it out because we have a JSON file, so it tells me, watch out, you have a JSON file. There's no real purpose to this except for saying that if I look at my console here, it writes out this error message, but it's kind of hard to see that it's an error message. It doesn't really stand out. Yeah, and there's a whole bunch of stuff from NodeMon here that comes in green. So apparently it's possible to send something to the console that is then written out with a color, and that is something that interests me. And we're going to use an external module for that. And there happens to be a module for that. It is called Chalk, and we'll start by installing it. I don't want to change my console here because NodeMon is running here, but luckily what I can do is I can click on my folder again and then say open an integrated terminal again, and that gives me a new console. So, and I had some from previously. So now I have the one with NodeMon in it, and I have the one that I just opened, and I can use this one to install stuff and so on, and the other one to see what happens in the output. So I set Chalk. That means we have to install it. So I can do npm install, exactly the same as we did for NodeMon. This is the install command, and then I say Chalk. And this is not something I'm using only for development. This is also, I would be using this in the production version as well. So I'm just going to stop the command there and say install that, and that will do its job. And then we can go back to my integrated, my NodeMon environment that I have here. And now that I installed it, I also need to import it. How do we do that? Same thing. Require and chalk. It's already here. Now, you could wonder why we don't have to tell Node.js where this thing lives. Yeah. Well, we don't have to tell it where it lives because in my package JSON, I imported this as a dependency. So chalk now lives here under the dependencies for this project. And when you install modules like that, all of the dependencies are installed in this node modules folder. So when I ask Node.js to look for a module using this require statement, when I do that, it will automatically look for that module under the node modules folder. So I don't have to specify a path here. Node.js already knows where it is. Okay. What do we do with chalk? Well, the interesting thing for chalk is that it allows me to modify how something is going to be written to the console. And the way to do that is by modifying the string that we have here. So instead of just passing the string to console info, I can modify it and I can say chalk and then a color. And then maybe we also want bold. And now I'm going to pass my string to that. So I've encapsulated my string, if you want, into a chalk function. And when I say save, and nodemon restarts my process, you can see that this is now written out in a bold type and in red. Yeah? And chalk supports something that is very common for JavaScript, but it's certainly Node.js modules and so on. And that is what is typically called chaining. So I can write chalk dot red and then dot bold. And if I wanted to do an underline, then I could chain it together with a bunch of more stuff. Yeah, that is something that you will see very, very commonly. It is something that we encountered last session with Axios, for example, and you see a nice example of that here as well. So this is the second step. If you want, you can use internal modules, and to do that, you just need a require statement. You can use modules that are not yet part of your project, and in order to do so, you might have to run npm install, and then you will have to run this require statement. Okay. And then you can use those as well, and you can use them in here. Now, this is all cool. But if I want to write 3 error messages, I will now have to write console info chalk red bold and then my string. And I guarantee you by the 7th time you do that, you're very tired of it, first of all. And secondly, you'll forget bold or do something else. So it would be much better if that would be a function. Yeah? But we already know how to do that. So that's not very challenging by itself. What we don't know yet, or we haven't used yet, is how can I make a function somewhere else? I don't want this to live in my index file. I want to write that once, and then I want to be able to use it in multiple files. So I want to write this out as an error message. Let's abstract this into a function, and let's see how we can store that function somewhere else. How do we do that? So in a way, if you think of it, how do we make our own JavaScript file that we can import the functionality of using a require statement? And it turns out that this is actually not that difficult. And the way to do it is, well, we're going to start by making a new file in that session 9 folder again. And so I could call this, you can call this whatever you want. I'm going to call it helper. You should be happy I decided not to call it penguin.js, but I think there are enough penguins already and it's going to get confusing. So I'm going to call it helper.js. Yeah? And this is just a JavaScript file, nothing special here. Now I want to define some methods here to write out, let's say, debug messages. And in order to do so, I'm going to use chalk. So I'm going to copy that chalk line from index, and I'm going to put it in my helper.js file. That's the first thing. Then the second thing is I'm going to try and come up with a function that writes out an error message. And that is not that difficult. We've seen how functions work. So we have a function, and then a function has a name. I'm going to call this debug error. And what do I want in there? Well, I want to write out a message. So I'm going to need a message attribute, and that's basically it. And then what does this function do? Well, it does exactly what we've said before. I'm a very lazy person, so I'm going to copy that line here, and we'll paste that in here. So my debug error function does console info chalk red bold, and then instead of the text we had before, I want it to write out this message that comes in. And that's basically it. Yeah? And because we want to be complete, and because I want to show you something in a second as well, I'm going to make a second function, and I'm going to call that warning instead of error. And instead of red, I'm going to make it yellow. So I can now write out an error message, and that will be written out in red. And I can write out a warning, and that warning will be output in yellow. That seems to make sense. Now, what do we do now? You could kind of predict that we're going to want to use a require statement on the index.js side because we want to use the stuff that we just written in helper. But if we're going to require it, how does node.js know which parts of this helper stuff it should actually import, it should give me access to? So we need a way to tell node.js what we are exporting from this file. Okay, it happens to be so that node.js defines something called module. And module has an exports variable. And this is really a variable. Yeah? So I could say exports is debug error. And this would be correct. If I save this, I'm not getting any error messages. This is actually correct. So I've written something called helper.js, and what helper.js exports is this function, debug error. Remember that in JavaScript, a function is an object, and it has a certain name, and I can use that name and assign it to variables and then use that to call it and so on. So all of that is possible. Yeah? There is only one problem with what I do here. I don't want to export debug error. I want to export multiple things. That would make more sense. Yeah? Now, there are different ways of doing that, but one of the easy ones is, how about I put this stuff in an object? So I tell Node.js that module exports for this file is an object. And that object has a property. The name of the property is debug error, and the value of that property is also debug error. Remember, this type of object is shorthand in Node.js for this. Yeah? So I'm actually saying create an object, give it a property that is has the name debug error, and assign to that property the value that is debug error, the function. But you don't have to write it this way. It's kind of double up if you want. I can shorten it to this. It means exactly the same. But because this is an object now, I can use this to put multiple things in there. And that will still work. So now I am exporting both the function debug error and the function debug warning. And if I wanted to, I could just define some other property. And what is the answer to everything? It's 42, right? Yes. So that is equally valid. So now I'm exporting 3 things from my helper file, 2 functions and a property called answer to everything, and the value of that thing is 42. So this on the side of the helper file. Let's go back to index. How do we use this? Okay, we already said that it would probably entail using a require statement. So we're going to start with that. But now, this is not a built-in module. So node.js doesn't necessarily know where this thing lives. So we will have to tell it. Where does helper.js live? It lives in the same folder as index.js. How do I write the same folder? I say a dot, which is the current folder, and then a slash, and then helper.js, and that should work just fine. Yeah, we're not using it yet, so but we'll get there. So now I am going to say, let's see if we can get this to work. Info, and we're going to use helper. That was already there. And now helper has a property called answer to everything. And if we run that, it writes out 42. So in fact, doing this is very, very similar to defining a variable here in my index file and then just using that, except that the variable is not defined locally, it is defined somewhere else, and I'm exporting it from that second file. Yeah. Now, this is not very useful and not what we want to use here. What we do want to do is we want to change this complex thing that we have here to this new function that we just defined, helper, and then debug error, and there. And this looks much cleaner, of course, and if we run it, it still does the same thing. And now if I say helper debug warning, it doesn't matter what we put in here, but I'm going to use debug warning now. It writes out our warning message. Yeah. So this is a way to take some of the functionality that you might want to write at the highest level and put it in a different file and then just import as you want. If you're dealing with this, I had a lot of trouble with this concept in the beginning because I didn't really understand what was going on in here, and that makes it difficult to understand what you need to do on the helper side and what you need to do on the index side to make this work. I think the key is, at least for me, the key was to understand that module exports is just a variable, yeah, and that you're assigning stuff to it, and then when you're importing it, you're taking that variable and you're assigning it to whatever you define here in your other file. And if you keep that in the back of your mind, it is not that difficult. Yeah? And what that does is it opens the way of doing something else. I've done here this helper debug warning thing. I could do this slightly different. I could say const debug warning. And we've seen this lessons ago, but I'm sure this will make some people frown now. So I'm going to write this and require, and I want this helper thing again. What does this do? Well, this was what we saw in one class. It's called deconstruction, if I remember correctly now. And what that means is we're expecting that we're getting an object on the right-hand side, and we're only interested in one of the properties for that object, and we're going to put that property in our constant on the left-hand side. So I'm actually, this would be, if you want, I'm confusing people now perhaps, but this is a very nice way of writing it. I could actually also write it like this. And it means exactly the same. Yeah? So I'm defining a constant, And what is the value of the constant? Well, look at the export from helper. The export from helper is this object, if you remember. Yeah. Look at the value of the export and then take the property from there. So this is exactly the same as this. And what I can do now is I can remove that from here. And if I run this, it still does the same thing. Why? Well, I'm taking out from everything that helper exports, I am taking out only debug warning, and then I am calling debug warning. The effect is exactly the same as what I did before. There are advantages and disadvantages to the two techniques, and I won't spend too much time on it, but in essence, when you do this, you're importing everything that this module exports. If I'm taking line 4, I am only importing that one function. And in some cases, that can allow whoever packages up the project and so on to do optimizations, because whoever does the packing up of this project knows that from this large helper thing that exists, the only thing that you're using is debug warning, so it could optimize away everything else in there. You're not using it anyway. The disadvantage, at least I find, is that helper.debug error to me is very, very clear. I have a module called helper and I'm using one of the functions from there. Line 12 is a lot less clear what happens. You really have to go look at where does this helper come from, this debug warning, where does it come from? Plus, you could now have a clash between something that you import and a function that you define in your index.js file itself. And you could think that's never going to happen, but I assure you, if your index.js contains enough JavaScript, you run a certain chance that it is going to happen. Yeah. So I think what you very often see, and what I like more, is the first way we did this, which would be not importing part of it, but importing the whole module and then really qualifying the function name with the module in front of it. Remember, though, that the name that you use here for the helper is not important. That's up to you. Helper here doesn't have to be the same as the name of the module. This is just a variable that you define and you assign the exports of that module that you're importing. That doesn't need to have the same name. So you can use whatever you want. But of course, in many cases, it makes sense to use the same thing because that makes it easier for you to figure out what is going on. Now, here we also don't need this chalk thing anymore because we're not using chalk. The only one who's using chalk is my helper.js, and I have my dependency for chalk in helper.js, so I don't have to import it here. Okay. So there is one additional level that you could take, but that would take us way too far. And so I'm not going to do anything for it. I am going to tell you about it. What we're doing here is defining our own local JavaScript file and then importing that. I could go one step further and I can write my own Node.js modules. Yeah? And I could even host that module in the same place that NPM hosts them and make it private so that only I can use it. And then if I do that, I could make a library of all the stuff that I frequently use. If I do that, I could put that, I wouldn't have helper.js here. I would just use NPM to install my private module, and it would be handled exactly the same way as all the public modules like Path and Chalk and so on. That is a possibility. It's more complex, but in certain environments, you might have to. Because if I use this in a Switch environment, and I won't say too much about Switch yet, but if I use this kind of stuff in a Switch environment, I'm going to shoot myself in the foot, because when you're writing apps in Switch or script packages, Switch kind of assumes that all the code other than your main file is going to be under node modules. And so if you try to make your own nice folder with all the library files that you want to use, and you convert that into a proper script, then Switch is going to throw away all of that stuff. Yeah? And the way to get around that and be able to make your own library is by hosting it as having it as a module, and that would mean, well, at least the ideal scenario is that you make your library as a private NPM module, and then treat it as any other modules in there. Then it would show up under known modules, and Switch would have no problem with it. So much for modules. If anyone has any questions about that, now would be a really good time, because I'm going to go to something else next. Everyone is scared of speaking up, so that makes it easier for me. It's good. So let's move on. So once more, this to me, the whole module thing to me is the essence of Node.js and working with Node.js. This is what makes it so incredibly powerful. And I think I said that last time as well. The challenge in many cases is figuring out whether someone has already created a module to do the things that you want and what that module is. And very often, I mean, don't forget that this is open source development, and I will not say too much about that. But it is open source development. And so very often, if you look for something, well, you probably are going to find 5 different solutions. And then, so the question is, which of the 5 is the one that I should really use in my project? And I can't really help with that other than saying, look at the documentation, evaluate properly before you do something. On systems like NPM, you have statistics about how many people are using this, how frequently is it updated. Look at those things before you decide to use a module. If you're going to use a module to talk to a database and there are only 5 people in the world that are using it, then yeah, it could be brilliant, but I'd probably prefer to put my money somewhere else. Yeah. So use the statistics. If you have to use reviews about it to see what the advantages and the disadvantages are. But finding the right modules is really important. I could probably figure out how I can write colors to the console, but finding a module like Chalk that just does it for me makes the whole process a lot less painful. So this, to me, is the essence of what happens in Node.js. Okay. So let's comment this and move on to the next topic. And the next topic for me, at least, is what do we do with Node.js? And I think there are, if you want to categorize it in high-end categories or high-level categories, there are probably 2 main things that make a lot of sense. One is we can use Node.js to write command line utilities. You get a CSV file from somewhere, you know you have to do something with it. How do you process it or change the format or whatever? And I need to do this on a server where I only have, it's a Linux-based server, and I can only run command line stuff. Okay, it is really easy to do this kind of stuff with Node.js. And I will show you, or try to show you, what is involved with that. Yeah, but if we're going to do command line tools, then we might need to figure out what we're going to do to test this. And well, I have I'm going to close this helper thing for now. We have a test environment here, and this dev script runs nodemon and then index.js. It doesn't pass any other commands to it. So we could just, that's not going to work, is it? I should use something I can pronounce in English, perhaps. There. So this gives me a new command. I'm still running my index.js, But now I am passing penguin, and I'm passing the parameter polar bear. And if you want this to look a little bit more like what a normal command line would be, I could give it some other stuff. So it doesn't matter what this is. It's just that if you're using command line tools, usually what will happen is that you pass some parameters. Yeah, you have input and you have output. And the question is, if you're dealing with Node.js to write command line tools, how do you do that? Well, this gives us some parameters that will be passed to my Node.js script. In order to use them, I need to go to my terminal and I need to quit nodemon, so Control-C. And then I need to do npm run dev again to restart it. And so now this process should be running again, but now each time it is going to get these command line parameters as well. How do we get to them? Well, actually, I'm not sure that will have worked because I didn't save. So let's do this again, because otherwise I'm going to wonder. There we go. No, npm run dev, yes. So why are you, it's not happy with me now. It might be because of this. Let's remove this one. You can test things as many times as you want, but it always causes problems. Would this be an issue? Let's once more. There we go. So I think inadvertently this this -v is actually a parameter for nodemon, so it interferes with the rest of the stuff I'm doing, which is not what I predicted. So let's do this again, and one last time. Sorry, I need to save this. Once you start making mistakes, it's really hard to get back. Now there we are. So you can see that it says starting node index.js, and then I have my command line parameters there as well. My nodemon process is running, it is entirely happy, and I have my index file that is entirely happy. I can actually remove this because I don't need it anymore, and I probably don't need this path thing anymore either, and that puts us back to square one. Good. So how do I deal with these command line parameters? Well, it turns out that there is something called, so let's say parameters, and there is something called process in Node.js that is always defined. And process, and you can already see it here, has something called argv. And the name is historical. They could have come up with something that makes sense, but argv goes all the way back to the beginning of when computers were still talking. Oh, no, it's animals. And they just kept it. What is that? Well, we can see. This is something that you should actually appropriate for yourself. It's a very good attitude. If you don't know what it is, just write it to the console and figure out what this beast is that you have. So when I write that to the console, you can see that it is an array. You can see that by the square brackets that we have here. And this array has elements. Unfortunately, or surprisingly, actually fortunately, but surprisingly, it doesn't have two elements. We expected two because I added two command line parameters. So we expected those two, but it actually writes out four of them. And what it writes out, these first two will always be there. So even if I don't add command line parameters, these first two parameters are always there. That's just the way Node does things. The first one is where Node lives. We're using nodemon. Nodemon uses the Node installation on my system. And well, that Node binary happens to be installed in the folder user local bin node, which is also the default folder if you run the installer where it will put stuff. And then the second parameter is the script that I'm running. And this, of course, can be very, very useful. if I'm running a command line tool and I want that command line tool to refer to some other things in the same folder as where the script is running, then now I have a way to do this. I have this full script and the name of the file, and I could use the path module that we used before to figure out what the directory name is. I think it's even called dir name. So that would give you the whole thing without the name of the script, and then you can look in that folder for the things that you're looking for. Yeah. So there is a reason that Node.js passes these two additional parameters. But of course, if you're not interested in them, you can get rid of them. So I could say something like const. What do we say? Let's not say const. Let's say something else. So we'll say real parameters. And now we're going to use a little trick. There is a, I have to be careful because there is a slice command in PDF Toolbox, and I have a tendency of remembering that one, but it's splice in this case. And I can say something like this. And now when we write this, and I made no mistakes, we're getting an array still, but now it only has the parameters that I am interested in. Yeah, so this splice command removes 2 items starting with item number 0. So I have 4 items, and I basically remove the first 2, and that gives me the actual command line parameters that I want. Yeah. Remark that we're very close to a real command line app, or to what we need to write a command line app now. I have a way to call this thing, and we're doing it here with NodeMon, but the normal way to call a node script would be on the command line, use node, and then the path to the script that you want to run. So we have that. We have a way to pass command line parameters and to figure out what these command line parameters are and use them. I have all the modules and stuff that I can use to figure out or use these command line parameters in interesting ways. And then the only part that is missing is, what about output? How do we write something? And of course, from this node thing, I can write files and so on. We've seen that last time. We've used read file from the FS module. There is also a write file, so I can use that as well. How can I interact with the rest of my environment? Well, I'll show you 2 things. The first is that I can say console info. Remember this process thing that we used before for the argument stuff? That also has a bunch of other interesting properties. And one of those is environment. And this is also for command line tools really interesting. This environment actually gives me all of the environment parameters that are defined when I'm running my application. So if I'm relying on some stuff that is defined on my computer to then use in my application, then I can do that. Yeah, I have access to that. And what I can also do with process, and this would not be a console thing, but simply like this process exit code, and then I can say 2. Now watch what happens. Ooh, that is not good. Yeah. Why does this happen? Well, because normally the interpretation is that if the exit code is 0, then everything went well and we'll just continue on going. Yeah. If the exit code is not 0, then it is some kind of error. Yeah. And I think I chose one that is particularly catastrophic for NodeMon. So we have to start the process again. Yeah, and then I'm going to remove the environment thing so that we can see what happens. And now you can see what happens. It does the code that it was supposed to do. So it writes out the command line parameters. And then it says your app crashed. And why does it say your app crashed? Because we're returning something that is not 0. If I change this to 0 and I run it again, I have no problem. If I change it back to something else, then it tells me again there is a problem. So this exit code gives you a way to communicate with the process that calls you. And if you would look at Switch, for example, and you look at the command line tool in Switch, then it has a property that you can set that lets it look at the exit code, and based on the exit code, decide whether the process was successful or not. If you would write your command line tool using node.js, you would have to use process.exit code to define success or not. And of course, normally you wouldn't hard code it. You would do a bunch of work, and then depending on whether it goes well or not, you would pass a certain exit code. Yeah. Okay. So much for command line tools. Moving swiftly along, because I see that I have 9 minutes left, which is going to be really, really tempting or difficult. So I'm going to comment out this one as well. And then what I simply want to do is introduce at least a little bit how you would normally see Node.js used in many environments. And that is, well, in many cases, it's used to build web servers. And this is a much more complex topic, but I want to give you some inkling of what is going on. And if I want to make a web server with Node.js, then I could do it with only the stuff that is built into Node.js, and it would be very painful and tedious. So I'm not going to do that. Instead, you have various other solutions that help you. And one of those solutions that help you is called Express. So I'm going to change back to my normal thing here. And then I'm going to say npm install Express. Express is just a module. There. And it's a module that specializes in letting you create web services if you want. So how does it work? It's very complex, but we'll try to keep it simple. So I can define an app now, and I can use this module, but if I want to use it here, what does that mean? It means that I have to define it. So const express is require, and it already knows about it because we installed it. So there we go. Okay. So I am using Express to do stuff, and a web server normally runs at a port. If you're not very familiar with this, the reason you don't know that is because all the HTTP stuff has a default port, 80. And so if you normally go to a website, you don't have to specify the port because it's going to use the default one for HTTP, and everyone is happy. In our case, we're setting up our own web server, so we're going to give it a port. And since 42 is the answer to everything, we're going to use it twice, in which case it's certainly the answer to everything. And now we're going to use Express, and that is actually not that difficult. We're going to say listen. Listen to what? Listen to our port. And then remember the session we had last time, this will take a completion function. So this is basically an asynchronous thing. So we started listening, and then we say, when you've started up this web server, why don't you tell us what is going on here? So console info, and I'm going to use backticks, server started, and listening on port, and an inline variable, and then our backtick again there. Yeah, so what do? We define an Express app. An Express app is something that is configured and has all the possibilities to create a web server for us. What does a web server do? A web server listens on a particular port or on multiple ports, and when someone asks it something, it gives a response. Yeah? And so that is why we say app.listen. We're telling Express that we want a web server that listens to port 4242, and that when someone asks it something, gives a response. And once that listening process has started, we're asking our web server to let us know so that we can write that out to the console. However, what we have not told Express at this point is what it should do if someone goes to this particular web server. So we need to add something for that as well. And that is also not that difficult. I can use the same app object and I can say, well, if someone does a GET call, and again, when you're not familiar with that, with web services that much, a GET call is what you do when you visit a website. You're asking for information. So it's nothing more complex than that. When someone does a GET call and they go to the root of our website, so without any other path or parameter or whatever, then what do you want me to do? And what I want to do is defined here. And this is typical for Express. I again have something asynchronous, and let me write something here first. There, but this is not going to go very well. So I'm going to change this. I am sorry. So I'm going to change this to res. I will explain in a second. Send, and then I think that should do the trick. So let's run this. I've saved it, and saving it runs it using nodemon. Now notice here at the bottom, two things. First of all, it wrote out that this line here that says server was started and it's now listening on port 4242. And then it doesn't end. Why doesn't it end? Well, because it's a web server and web servers don't end. They just sit there until someone goes and asks them something. Yeah? So the fact that it doesn't end is very promising. If it would end, we would have done something wrong. Yeah? So it should have started a web server on port 4242. And then what we've told Express is that if someone asks information from the root of this thing, then what we want to do is send something back. And what we send back is we're here. These two variables that you see here, they come into play every time you use a GET call or a POST call or whatever in an Express web server. The first one is the request. So this contains all the information from what was asked from us. And the second one is the response. And the response allows you to specify the answer that you're giving. Yeah? And the response object would allow you to return a JSON file. It allows you to return just a string, as we do here. It would also allow me to return a bunch of HTML, which you would normally see in a web server. What does this do? Well, if I go to Safari and I go to localhost 4242, which is my web server, then it says the answer that I gave it. Yeah? Of course, this is not really exciting because it's just a piece of text. So let's do one last thing and see if we can make it at least a little bit exciting. So what I'm going to do is use another module, the same one we used last week, Axios. Remember from not last week, last session, Axios is something that allows you to do calls to APIs and stuff like that. Yeah. If we want to use it, we have to install it. So npm install Axios, and that will do some stuff, and we can go back to our node.mon environment. And now we need to use it, and we're going to use it to create some kind of dynamic response in here. And for that, well, we need some kind of API, and I've looked for one that in these dark times will make us feel a little bit better about ourselves. So, and I found one, I think. So we'll call this const result, and then Axios. And the URL is, bear with me, HTTPS in this case. What is it? Affirmations.dev. You'll see what it does in a second. Now, this isn't exactly what I want. I want to do something with that here. And that means I don't want to send back a fixed string, but I want to send back result data dot affirmation. This is simply because that happens to be what is returned from this Axios call. I don't want to deal with asynchronous stuff now. So from last time, we know that you can avoid that by putting a wait in front of it, and that makes it synchronous. If you paid attention last time, then you wait that you can't use a wait unless it's in an async context. And that means that my function here should be async. Okay, let's see how many mistakes we made. It still starts without a problem, so we have high hopes. And let's refresh this. So what does this affirmations API do? Well, it writes all kinds of, it will give you a very positive message every time, which is a nice way of ending this series on JavaScript, because, well, you can do this, you've got this. And small progress is still progress, yeah? It's actually very, very addictive to start reading these because, well, it is. So once more, what happens here? I think it bears to go over it again. So we're using an Express module because Express is really good at setting up web services. It gives us a whole bunch of built-in capabilities. And when I use Express, I need to create an app. And that is what we do here. And this app is then what we're going to use to do all of our work. It is the app that you instruct to listen on a certain port or on multiple ports. That would be possible as well. And it is the app that you hear, well, I simply write out, you don't have to do this, but it's quite useful because after a while you forget which port you used, and this tells you what port this is running on. Yeah. So app listen starts the web server. Once I call that, I have a web server that works, and that means I can use a browser and go to it. And because my web server runs on the same platform as what I'm using here to develop, the URL for it will be localhost and then 4242 in this particular case. Yes? And then the other bit is that I have to tell my web server what it should look for and then what it should return. And so the simplest call is app-get, and then the home, the root of the web server if you want. And then I'm using Axios to come up with a response and return that. What that also means is that if I would go to 4242 and then penguins, I don't need two slashes here, I'm going to see cannot get penguins, which is very, very sad. No one should ever be in a position that they can't get penguins. Why is that? Well, it's because you don't have a service that looks for that /penguins part of your website and returns something. So the web server doesn't know what to do, and it's going to just give you a generic error. This can't be found. While if I go back to my root, well, now we're back at getting. Some of these messages are really disturbing, but well, you get back to getting these affirmations. Yeah. So in a real scenario, you would of course not stop here. You would look at writing multiple routes like app.get for multiple parts of the website, and you might have post routes because someone could post data to you, and so on and so on. Yeah. There is something that could help you. I'm not going to demonstrate it because I think it's a bad idea, but there is something that is called Express Generator. And Express Generator makes what is typically is scaffold, well, it's called scaffolding if you want. So if I go to my my folder here, I actually prepare these sessions. It's often necessary. So if you use this Express Generator, you would get something like that folder called Penguins that I have here, in which I have an app.js, and then you have a whole bunch of setup code, all using that app that comes back from Express, yeah? Where it sets up views, a view system using a templating system, where it sets up routes, where it sets up a whole bunch of stuff that you need in a typical production workflow. Yeah. Why don't I just want to use this to show you what Express does? It's because I fundamentally think that this is a bad idea before you understand what the different parts are. Yeah? This will give you a bunch of scaffolding code, and yes, it sets up a whole bunch of things correctly. But if I ask you what a cookie parser is, or why you need routes and how they function, then you're not going to be able to know that from using this Express Generator. So I think Express Generator is a really good idea once you understand what the parts are, because it can save you some typing and it sets up a bunch of stuff in the correct way. Yeah, and it prepares a bunch of folders for you and so on and so on. That's all very good, but you should first understand what the individual parts do so that you know, now that we have this scaffolding code, where do I interact with it? Which parts do I need to change, and so on and so on. And that is something that the Express Generator will not tell you, and that you need to figure out by, well, in other ways. Yeah? If you want to know more about what we've done here, so if you want to go from here and understand in more detail what this is and so on, I would, if I were you, and I was in the same situation, I would go to something like LinkedIn Learning. There are other platforms like that, but look for a course that explains the ins and outs. And there are a couple of really nice ones on LinkedIn Learning. A couple that I did. If you're interested in what I did, then go to my profile on LinkedIn. I think you can see the courses that I took, and there's a few in there that are actually quite good. Yeah, it depends a little bit on what you want to use this for. There is a big difference between using Node.js to build a website that shows UI and stuff like that, and using Node.js to build, for example, an API. Those are two different things. But I would start with a basic Node.js course. And that will probably take you some time if you want to actively follow along and go through it. But it's a great way of figuring out what the different parts mean, and then go back to it. And if you then want to use this scaffolding tool, this generator tool, by all means. But I would not do that first because it's not going to make sense.